It was a quiet, ordinary night in a small town. The clock struck 11 as Melissa sat alone in her living room, the faint glow of her phone illuminating her face. She had recently moved into an old Victorian house, a structure that seemed to carry the weight of history in its creaky wooden floors and peeling wallpaper. It had been a difficult year for her. She was hoping this change of scenery would help her heal after a rough breakup. The house had charm. It was a fixer-upper, sure, but the price had been right, and Melissa felt a sense of possibility in each dusty room. As she looked around, she imagined the life she could create here. The neighborhood was quiet, maybe a little too quiet, but that was fine by her. She welcomed the peace, the chance to escape the noise and chaos of her previous life. But on this particular night, the stillness began to weigh heavily on her. She glanced at the clock again. Midnight was approaching, and the shadows in the room felt thicker, the silence more pronounced. Just as she set her phone down, intending to retire for the night, it buzzed sharply on the coffee table. A notification appeared on the screen, no caller ID. Her heart raced a little at the sight. Who would call at this hour? The thought sent a shiver through her. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the screen. For a moment, she considered letting it go to voicemail, but something compelled her to answer. It was as if the call held a significance she couldn't ignore. "Hello," she said, her voice tentative. On the other end, there was silence. The kind that stretches and stretches until it feels suffocating. She thought about hanging up, but then she heard it, a low, raspy breath, lingering in the air like a distant echo. Melissa's heart sank, a chill running down her spine. She glanced around the room, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, watching her. The breathing continued, slow and rhythmic, filling the silence like a heavy fog. Just as quickly as it had started, it faded away. The call ended abruptly, leaving her in a thick shroud of confusion and fear. She sat there for a moment, stunned. Maybe it was a prank, she thought, trying to dismiss the anxiety creeping in. After all, it was just a phone call. With a shaky breath, she placed the phone back on the table and stood up, trying to shake off the lingering feeling of dread. But moments later, her phone buzzed again. Another call from the same block number. A sense of unease crept into her stomach, churning with each passing second. Why was someone calling her again? What did they want? Ignoring the growing knot of anxiety, she walked over and answered once more. This time, there was stillness on the other end, as if she were talking to an empty room. The only sound was her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as though the very act of answering had drawn a curtain back on something unseen and dangerous. She hung up, annoyance mingling with fear. As she turned to put her phone in another room, the feeling of being watched intensified. The shadows seemed to shift, creeping closer as the chill in the air thickened. She made her way to the kitchen, where she left her phone on the counter, away from the bedroom, hoping the calls would stop. As she returned to the living room, her unease only grew. The house creaked and groaned, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Just as she settled into bed, trying to force herself to sleep, the phone buzzed again, this time vibrating against the counter with urgency. The sound echoed through the house, almost mocking her attempts to find peace. With trepidation, she got out of bed and walked down the dark hallway toward the kitchen, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The air felt dense, heavy with anticipation. As she reached for the phone, it suddenly stopped ringing, leaving her standing in the dark, feeling foolish for getting worked up over what was likely a prank. But before she could turn away, her heart dropped as she heard a soft tapping sound coming from somewhere in the house. It was a gentle but persistent noise, like fingernails lightly scraping against wood, resonating through the stillness. She paused, straining to listen, her instincts kicking in as the hair on the back of her neck stood up. She rationalized it, telling herself it was just the house settling, an old structure making its peace with the night. But as the tapping continued, growing louder and more deliberate, her rational mind faltered. The sound seemed to travel, moving closer, creeping from the hallway toward her bedroom. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic breathing that filled the silence of the house. She felt a wave of terror wash over her, freezing her in place. The air grew colder, and she pulled the blankets tighter around her, a futile attempt to shield herself from the encroaching fear. Suddenly, the phone buzzed again. This time, it felt ominous, like a warning echoing in the silence. She glanced at the screen, now illuminated in the dark, displaying the same blocked number. Panic surged through her, igniting a fight-or-flight response. She was alone, miles away from friends or family, in a house that felt increasingly unfamiliar. The tapping resumed, slower this time, as though whatever was making the sound was savoring her fear. She held her breath, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching her, lurking just beyond her line of sight. The door to her bedroom loomed before her, a threshold between safety and the unknown. She could feel the presence growing stronger, an oppressive weight that pressed against her chest. The breathing outside her door grew heavier, almost labored, and she instinctively knew that whatever was out there was not just a figment of her imagination. It was real. With a jolt, the door handle began to turn slowly, as if someone were testing it, probing for entry. The room plunged into darkness as the shadows deepened, and she felt paralyzed, unable to move, unable to scream. The door creaked open just a crack, revealing a sliver of darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the door swung shut again, the sound reverberating in the silence. Her breath caught in her throat. The room felt impossibly cold now, a bone-deep chill that seeped into her very bones. The tapping returned, now coming from the window, as if something had changed position. Desperation surged through her. She had to get out. Gathering her courage, she bolted from the bed and made her way toward the bedroom door. The tapping grew frantic, almost angry, as if whatever had been outside was now aware of her movement. She reached for the doorknob, her hands trembling, and pulled the door open just wide enough to slip through. The hallway was dark, but she could see the faint glow of her phone's screen casting eerie shadows along the walls. She stumbled toward the stairs, her heart racing as she descended into the cold embrace of the lower level. The tapping had stopped, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. As she reached the living room, she could see her phone lying on the coffee table, illuminated with a new notification. With trembling hands, she grabbed it, her heart racing as she quickly navigated to her contacts to call for help. Just as she pressed the call button, the lights flickered above her, plunging the room into darkness. In that instant, the temperature dropped even further, her breath visible in the chill. She felt a presence behind her, an oppressive energy that sent chills racing down her spine. Turning slowly, she felt her heart drop. The silhouette of a figure stood in the doorway, a shadow without form or definition. It was then she realized she had left the door to her bedroom ajar. The figure stepped forward, moving into the faint light. It was almost humanoid in shape but distorted, with elongated limbs and an absence of features that made her stomach churn. A deep instinct screamed at her to run, but her body betrayed her, frozen in fear as the figure advanced, its movements unnaturally fluid. Just as it reached for her, the lights flickered back on, illuminating the room in stark clarity. But the figure was gone, leaving only an oppressive silence in its wake. She staggered back, her heart pounding in her chest, and in that moment, she decided to flee. Racing to the front door, she fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The air was thick with tension as she threw the door open and bolted into the night, desperate for escape. As she stepped outside, the cool air hit her like a slap, grounding her in the reality of her surroundings. She looked back at the house, now looming ominously behind her, its windows dark and uninviting. In the distance, she could see the faint glow of streetlights, and she took off toward them, leaving the terror behind. But even as she ran, she could feel the sensation of being watched creeping back in. She turned to look over her shoulder one last time, half expecting to see the figure lurking in the shadows. Instead, there was nothing, just the stillness of the night, a quiet that felt heavy with unspeakable dread. Little did she know, the calls would never stop. Even as she found safety in the light, the whispers would follow her, haunting her every step.